So welcome to another episode of Software Architecture im Stream. This time with Sam Newman. Sam, great to have you on the show. And actually this is the first episode that we are going to prepare for OOP conference. And that is also why it's on Wednesday and not on Friday as usual. And next week we will, because Sam is going to do a presentation on at OOP conference, so I'm looking forward to that. And next week we will have another guest on Thursday. That will be Daniel Terhorst North, and he will also do a presentation at OOP. And we will also do some shows from OOP itself, also in German and in English. And I will just put the links to the announcements for those shows in the chat. So please do have a look at. I'm looking forward to welcome you at OOP conference also, and at the streams there. But well, hello to Sam again. So Sam, great to have you on the show. Do you want to say a few words about yourself? What are you doing, and who are you?
I mean, who I am is a deep philosophical question, so I'll stick to maybe my CV. But so I'm a programmer, kind of operations-y person by trade. So I've always been in the industry for about 25 years. I started with Fortran 77, and I've finished with boxes and arrows. That's been my career arc so far. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been focused as a consultant, now working for the last few years as a freelancer. And kind of the areas that I've found myself focusing on are the space of continuous delivery. So getting software from people's laptops into production as quickly as possible. So all the things that come with it, infrastructure, automation, all that. Cloud, and helping people use the cloud well. And specifically here, I'm really talking primarily about public cloud. But the thing I'm probably known for, I guess, is microservices, which is a style of architecture I became interested in primarily because of the continuous delivery angle. And so I kind of ended up we were talking in the pre-stream. There is a pre-stream, people, but we don't record that, where I was saying sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be good. And I was lucky enough to write the first book in English on microservices. So I got that out there, and then I became known as the microservices person. So like any lucky person, I put it all down to just my own sheer talent, and I've been mercilessly pursuing that furrow in the following 7 years.
Right, and actually you did write another book about migrating from Monolith to microservices, and I think that's something that we're going to discuss further today. So what are microservices? I think the term is not really that well defined, so what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I define them as a style of modular service-oriented architecture, which focuses on the independent deployability of the individual services, with the boundaries of those microservices primarily being defined around the business domain. So I talk to them about, I say there's distributed systems, there's service-oriented architectures, and that you can view microservices as being in a very opinionated style of service-oriented architecture. I'm very happy if people call it SOA, the good bits, echoing that great JavaScript book. But that's how I kind of approach it. The thing maybe that distinguishes it from more SOA in general is a focus on how we find those boundaries, a focus on this idea of independent deployability, with a side order of aiming for technological agnosticism in the interfaces between them, and in really being fairly strict in terms of avoiding sharing of databases for storing a kind of shared mutable state.
So concerning the comparison to SOA, one thing that I believe is different between microservices and SOA is that SOA is more like an enterprise architecture thing, where you would talk about the structure of the whole enterprise, of the IT of the whole enterprise, where microservices seems to be on the system architecture level. So you could have one system implemented as microservices. Would you agree, or is that not so important? Because you didn't mention it when you compared SOA and microservices.
I think there are lots of sort of forces around that gave us microservices. Neil Ford has described microservices as the first post-DevOps architecture style. And I think historically, when I first started realizing there was such a thing as architecture, you often had quite hard divides between people that would work on, say, the physical infrastructure of an application, the physical architecture and the logical architecture. There would be different career paths even. I think what's happened as we've been able to more dynamically provision and manage our infrastructure, that we've basically collapsed those worlds a bit more. And so we are now, I would argue that people would like to have built things that look like microservices 20 years ago, but actually we didn't have the understanding or the technology to allow it. So you could potentially argue that our ability to dynamically provision infrastructure, for example, has allowed us to indulge the worst excesses of service-oriented architectures. But there is something here about I think if you're going to be an architect working in a microservices environment, you actually end up having to bridge more of those worlds. You have to be aware of the domain, but you do actually have to be aware of the physical deployment topology to make sensible decisions, because so many of the architectural decisions you make when things become finer grained have such an impact in how the system actually runs and behaves and how it can be managed and maintained.
So, as I've also written a book about microservices, I think a lot of people would think that we would talk about how great microservices are and how you should use them. And actually, as you said, we had a conversation before the stream, and we decided to talk about a completely different subject and have try to answer a different question. So, should we use microservices at all? I mean, obviously they are very complex, so shouldn't we just stay away from them?
Probably. So I don't know, we may have different views on this, but my kind of my engagement model when I work with people, or people ask me that question, is, I know a lot about microservices and the cost of creating and running them and the impact of them. They're a style of architecture which comes with quite a lot of baggage. And so typically my default position is I kind of need to be convinced that they're a good idea. And that seems to be the opposite to how a lot of the industry is acting at the moment, where microservices seem to be the default approach for everything. I'm old enough to remember the phrase, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. The idea was whenever there was a decision to be made, you just buy the IBM product. Because everybody else was doing it. So clearly your decision can't be wrong because everyone does it. If the product turns out to be wrong, it's the industry. It was a way of making a decision quickly and abdicating responsibility by just doing what everyone else does. We're seeing it with microservices. I'm seeing time and again with the clients I work for that they've made the decision to do it without understanding why. For me, microservices should be a tool that you've got in your toolbox, and in some situations it's right to pull it out. I think it's also worth saying that we often want to almost approach this in a didactic, almost binary mechanism. Monolith microservices, as though they're two completely different things. Whereas in reality, it's not really like when you're moving to a microservice architecture, it isn't like flicking a big giant switch. It's much more like a spectrum. So I think there's the decision to say, yes, we should try microservices, but then there's also how aggressively you do that migration if you're moving from an existing system. But my default position tends to be convince me and convince yourselves, and to recognize that, your customers, the users of your software, probably your boss, your shareholders, if you have them, the taxpayers, if you're a government, couldn't care less about microservices. To them, it is utterly unimportant. The fact that you've decided to use that architecture isn't going to make them happier or make their lives better. So you should always view the decision to use microservices as a way of saying, we've got a problem that we can't solve in other easier ways. We're trying this. So see it as a means to an end. And in many, many, many cases of the clients I work with, probably more than half, they could achieve the outcomes that they need without needing to use microservice architecture.
And I actually think this is a very smart and important point, because it means that as a software architect or as someone who is somehow developing software, it's important to be able to justify your decisions and not to rely on the industry standard, whatever that might be. So how could I convince you that we really need to use microservices, or what do you see out in the field? What are really valid reasons to use microservices, and is that like the majority of projects? So maybe that's the best first question. So if you use this approach and you go to a client, what's the usual outcome? That they say, oh, we shouldn't use microservices, or is the outcome, oh yeah, we should use microservices, and here are the reasons, and they actually convince you?
So I would say if there's one reason that's the most common and compelling reason for adoption of microservices, and I say this amongst my larger clients, which tend to be enterprises, but are also sometimes large sort of scale-ups, a lot of the driver behind the microservice adoption is actually really around enabling organizational autonomy. They like this idea of independent deployability. They recognize that as they throw people into their organization, they're not necessarily getting the return on that. Things are getting slower, right? Some of them may have even read the mythical Man Month, which is a surprise to me. If only half of the people that bought that book had read it, we'd be better off. So you've got this issue where they've got larger organizations now, and they realize they want parts of that organization to be able to decide and act and operate with an improved degree of autonomy. And that is often the most compelling reason for adopting microservices. Very few of them actually really have scale issues that require microservices. Some do, but it's rare. Some of them are looking for a wider variety of technology, although again, that's rare. Those are more bonuses. But if there's one normal reason, that would be it. I think a lot of the other times I get approached by customers who are talking about things like, we need to scale our application, there are often other things that I'd look to first. So when someone says, I want to scale my app, okay, I say, well, let's run through all the different things. Let's firstly make sure you've got the right information around your scaling bottlenecks. Now let's look at all the ways we can scale your application that are easier than microservices. Let's try all those things first. And often you'll find a way to fix the problem without needing that scale. So I think if it's the biggest single reoccurring reason is that when you just sit down is the organizational autonomy. It's not often articulated as that, though. In terms of whether or not they listen to my advice, that's a different thing, and that's partly that's a bit of the curse of the consultant in a way. A lot of this depends on when I get engaged. So often I'm an independent. I often get pulled in when someone's already made the decision to use microservices. And so having me come in, a lot of people expect that I'm going to be the fanboy cheering them on. And it's like, I see myself more in those situations as being more like a calm hand on the tiller to try to help guide the boat. I've certainly been in situations where the decision has been made to use microservices, and so they will be using microservices. And so in that setting, often my role is to find a way for them to use that most sensibly. And that might be, again, coming back to this idea of it being a spectrum, saying, okay, well, I'm not convinced, so let's try and keep it at the more conservative end. Maybe let's say I have one microservice for every 20 developers, right? And run like that for 6 months or a year and see how that goes. So trying to give them a way that if they've decided and are committed to that direction, to giving them a framework to operate in, which allows them to explore that space safely.
You just mentioned the Mythical Man Month. So do you want to say a few words about that? Because you said it's such an important book.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. I think I've got the 20th edition anniversary copy, which came out, I think, about 18 years ago. So it's an old book, but it's a collection of essays by Frederick Brooks. There's a lot of stuff in that book that's still really useful, and a lot of misunderstood terms come from that book. The 10x developer stuff originated in that book and was somewhat misunderstood. But one of the things he talks about is this idea that you can't throw people at a problem. And so he says, to take an analogy, I live in the countryside. I've got these big fields around me. There's a field of wheat opposite. And if you had one person with a scythe, and let's say it takes them a week to harvest all of that wheat, you could actually add a second person and do that in half a week, because some problems are to a large degree parallelizable. There's not a lot of coordination needed between those two people harvesting that wheat, other than let's make sure I don't slice your leg off accidentally with my scythe. So you've got to like rope it off. The problem with computing is that so many of the things that we work on aren't actually easily parallelizable, because we are building things which are too interconnected. We're in situations where we require too much coordination between people in different roles, or just from an architectural point of view. And so that adding more people can't necessarily speed things up, because we haven't designed either our organizations or our architectures in a parallelizable way. It's probably worth reflecting when that chapter was written would have been around the time when we were talking about modular software and component-based architectures. And at that time, probably the only way that you would have achieved something like independent deployability is the properties of some mainframes allowing you for hot swapping of modules. And that was the closest that you could kind of get to. In many ways, Fred's book is a project manager's book. It's not a programmer's book, although he was a technologist as well. And so he approached it from the management side of things, explaining why these things can't be done. He wasn't necessarily positing solutions from an architecture point of view. But I think it would almost be interesting for someone to go over his essays and approach them from a modern commentary point of view. But I think it's something every project manager should read, and system administrators too. Sorry, any system developer should as well. But some is dated, but there's some still really interesting ideas in that. And that's like I like going back over old stuff every now and then and brushing off the cobwebs and trying to read those things in a new light. And I think often the pace of change in our industry, we're all time poor. There's so much information to absorb. In the wake of there always being something new for us to look at, we don't actually give ourselves enough time to look at and remember the lessons that we've already shared with each other.
So in a way, what you're saying is that this problem around autonomy that the Mythical Mammoth already discusses, that microservice might be a solution to that. What are some alternatives? So do you see any alternatives at all, or is that really the one common reason for doing microservices, and there is hardly any alternative? So that's why it's such a convincing argument for you.
Well, I think the really important thing to understand about the autonomy angle is that microservices can't deliver on that unless you actually also change the organization. And in many ways, it starts with the organization. So I've certainly spoken to people who wanted to create a more autonomous organization. And so microservices were the way to do that. And there's lots of history and research around how you do that from an organizational point of view. So I think it has to happen with that organizational transformation as well. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefit. In terms of achieving that sort of more, that sort of organizational autonomy, I mean, one of the ways you do this is to have entirely separate systems that are not connected in any way, shape, or form. So you could be shipping lots of different products fundamentally that aren't interconnected in any way. The downside to that can be that you can end up with organizations which can be less of the sum of the parts. So I work with a financial services provider in Australia that actually has loads of different brands, and they're all like different company units, and they all operate independently from one another. However, that means that they've got information about me stored in 15 different places, and they get no value. They can't see me across all those spaces because they're so disparate. So you end up with, in those environments, the more isolated you make yourself, that becomes more challenging. And I would also say that autonomy at scale thing, that is do you need to be the scale? Do you need your organization to be big? And I think that's kind of a separate question. I think it's going to be interesting seeing the forcing functions that are happening now in terms of people doing more remote working. I think it's easier to have people coordinating and chatting and conversing around, say, a piece of code if they're in the same time zone or close to the same time zone, and ideally in the same office is best if you can. And that means you can have a well tight-knit team that can storm around one thing that they all collectively own. As we're increasingly seeing teams which are maybe more remotely distributed in terms of time zones, your communication goes between team members of being synchronous to being more asynchronous. And so I suspect that that shifting force in terms of where people now live and work may well result in an increased desire to have architectures like this, because you can say, okay, well, we've now basically got a whole load of people that are in CET plus 3. So we're going to have you actually own something so you can collaborate and coordinate. And the people in CET and GMT, they'll work on something else. And I think you'll start seeing a bit more of that happening. I mean, obviously, if we go into the technology point of view, in terms of that independent deployability aspect, there are technologies out there that do allow for hot swapping. Mainframes have done this for decades, which developers are always amazed by. Erlang, the Beam virtual machine, which can do this as well. They talk about their modules effectively, they're called processes. And it's actually interesting when I talk to OSGI people, I try and explain why what OSGI gives you is not at all what you get with the Erlang Beam virtual machine. So OSGI, of course, gives you the ability to define a Java module, and theoretically, I can hot swap those into a running JVM. However, it's not the fault of OSGI in any way, shape, or form. The JVM was not designed with that in mind. And it's very, very easy for you to do things innocently as a developer that requires you to have to cycle the whole JVM for things to be instantiated. So you've got like interesting things like the Beam VM, which has a capability to say, okay, I've got version 1 of a module. I'm going to drop in version 2 of the module, allow traffic to drain off on one, swap it over to the second one, and have that all within a single process. You can do that. So we have technological implementations out there, but despite a lot of work by some very, very smart people, Erlang as a runtime and an ecosystem has not caught on. And that brief little foray we had of people building distributed systems in Erlang, as you see with things like RabbitMQ or React, that doesn't happen anymore. And the efforts that, say, Trifork have had to go through to keeping the Erlang community going and the software around it going, it's unfortunate. I remain hopeful that the final promise of Jigsaw in the world of the JVM comes to fruition, and that we finally have a modern modular runtime in the JVM. At the current pace of change, it will take another 20 years, but maybe in 2042, the JVM will have the same capabilities regarding hot swapping of modules as Erlang had 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But with Oracle stewardship, you'd never do know how long that's going to take.
And there is a lot of legacy software that you need to be compatible to, and that's also a problem. Yeah. So Erlang, the future of programming since, what is it, 1975 or so?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So. So we've spoken about microservices and how they are actually quite complex and shouldn't probably be a default architecture choice. So on the other side, there are monoliths. So what is a monolith?
There are different definitions again. I mean, the way I typically define a monolith when I'm talking in the context of microservices is I describe a monolith as a unit of deployment. And so if I deploy my entire system as a monolith in one unit, it is a monolith. The most common, well, I think when people think monolith, a lot of the time they're thinking really of a single process system. So all of my code is packaged together. The canonical Ruby on Rails application, for example, which is a great choice for quickly building a web application. All my code is packaged together in a single process. When I want to change a single line of code, I still have to deploy the entire piece. And actually, I think a single process monolithic application or a modular monolithic application can be a very sensible approach. So effectively, a modular monolith is like an old static linking approach, right? I'm putting together jar files or NuGet packages and deploying a unit. Another variation on the monolith, though, is typically more problematic, and that would be the distributed monolith. So that is something which looks a bit like a microservice architecture, because I've got lots of different processes communicating with one another. But for whatever reason, whenever you want to make a change, you have to deploy the entire system. So you've got all the complexities of a distributed system with the limitations of the monolithic deployment model. And typically that distributed monolithic situation you're in, they have a much higher ceremony cost around deployments and releases. The scopes of those releases as a result tend to be larger, and you'll have a lot more problems in terms of releasing those things frequently. So I have worked with clients that are in that situation of being in a distributed monolithic system, and have actually suggested that they merge things back together again, stabilize a single process monolithic application before breaking things out again. So for me, it's a unit of deployment.
Which means that the monolith might also be well structured. It's not about the
Absolutely.
sort of... Yeah.
And I think that's super important. It's not a value judgment. Right, but I think I get people saying, am I doing microservices? Am I doing microservices? Like, actually, it doesn't really matter if it's working for you. You should absolutely not see the fact that you've got a monolithic system as a bad thing at all, at all. There are huge numbers of companies I can point to that have become incredibly successful through building monolithic applications. Facebook being obviously the poster child for this. Salesforce, right? 15 years of development on a Java monolithic application. More recently, we've got Shopify, right? Who are a great company who do a really good... I buy a lot of stuff via Shopify now. They've got one of the best, slickest checkout processes in the world. And the bulk of their core application is based on a monolithic application. They've talked quite well about their mindset around that. It works for lots of people, and it might work for you. So it's not a value judgment. You can implement a big ball of mud in a monolith, a single process monolith, or in a distributed monolith. I would argue you can't, if you try to implement a big ball of mud in a monolith, in a microservice architecture, it would end up becoming a distributed monolith, because that's the problem with a big ball of mud.
Okay, so if both options are valid options, why would you migrate from monolith to microservices then? I mean, you wrote a whole book about it, so there has to be some reason.
For me, it always starts with having a clear understanding about what we're trying to achieve. And so I think the distinction I try and make here is and this is something I got from an old colleague at Thoughtworks called Sriram Narayan, and he talks about trying to separate outcome from activity. As technologists, we can often get focused on the activity. I am building microservices. Well, no, actually, why? I'm trying to move to microservices to achieve some outcome. We'll focus on what is the outcome you're trying to achieve. What is it you want out of this migration? So I always start there. What is it you think that you need and that you hope microservices will give you? Once you've defined what that outcome is, and that's typically something that maybe your organization is trying to do, or it's a problem, you can't handle the number of customers that you've got signing up for your services, you need to geographically expand, whatever it might be. That's the goal you're trying to aim for. Well, let's define that outcome. Now let's actually think about all the different ways we could achieve that outcome. And yes, microservices in the mix. A lot of this is about getting technologists to be honest with themselves. And it comes back to what you said earlier, which I think was really well put. You've got to be able to justify your decisions. Now, when someone says, I'm doing microservices because we need X, have they actually thought about all the other things that they could do to achieve that outcome? My goal is never with a customer to get them to use microservices. My goal is to hopefully help them solve the problems they've got. So for me, it starts, lives and dies with that outcome, is focusing on that. And then that also then solves the problem of what you start putting out of a monolithic system. If people say to me, which things should I put out my monolith first? It's like, well, you need to prioritize, right? How do I prioritize? Well, I've got to know what I'm trying to achieve. If you don't know what your outcome is, you're not going to be able to prioritize. If you can't prioritize, you're just doing things for the sake of it, which is great for big consultancies. I'm not going to lie, right? Many of us have been gainfully employed on those projects, but and I've got books to sell. I've got a mortgage to pay for. But, it's even so, I think it's just about being honest. Focus on the outcome, drive by the outcome, and give yourself permission to change your mind. I really get worried when the CEO of a company has heard of microservices, because the moment they are invested in your activity, it becomes very difficult for you to then realize you've made the wrong decision and change your mind. Politically, socially, that's too difficult. So I want my CEO to be invested in the outcome that we're all moving towards. And at the moment, we think the best way to get there is doing X, microservices. We might change our mind. We might learn things. Some new technology might come along. So I think if we separate outcome from activity, it also makes it a lot easier for us to change our minds in a way that doesn't get us a lot of corporate flack and stops us. And it avoids too much of that, of that sort of sunk fallacy cost.
So what is the typical outcome that convinces you to start with the migration? Is it the same that we just discussed, better being a team autonomy, or is it different if you look at migrations towards microservices?
as I say, I think this is partly because I get involved when people have already made the decision. So for me, it's just to be self-selecting. They bring me in once they've already made the decision, and so normally that's going ahead. Something's going to happen in that space. Normally, what tends to happen in that process is it's then about where you make that change, where you focus on that change. And this is the other thing that I think people misunderstand, is that this is not a quick sprint. A lot of my clients are taking systems that took them 10, 20 or 30 or even more years to build. The migration into a microservice architecture is not going to happen overnight. And so really a lot of it is around saying, okay, well, have a big picture, but actually let's focus on what we want to try and achieve in the next 6 to 12 months. And then setting up a path towards that, putting in some checkpoints around that process. So this is kind of fundamentally an evolutionary approach, rather. And so then it might be, okay, actually, you've got 7 or 8 different bits of your teams working on this, for example. We won't try and get all of those people doing microservices at once. We actually might go to one of those teams who actually maybe has people that are quite predisposed to these ideas. Maybe they've got the best skills in that area at the moment. And maybe they're working on a part of the system that is not meaningless, but also isn't the most critical core. Let's make some change there with that team first off. Then once you've done that, you can take one team quite a long way in a short period of time. Then what you can use is take the lessons you've learned from that and then try scaling those ideas out to other parts of the organization. There's always different organizational pressures that vary from different client to client. The context is different, the tools, the people, everything's different. And so trying to take a model that worked well for company A and saying, let's do it here, isn't always going to work. And so I kind of prefer that, let's get one team moving, and then let's use that team's experiences inside their own organization to scale that up. But it all starts for me with saying, you need to get one microservice into production and actually being used before you really understand what running microservices is like in your organization. A large amount of the pain and suffering of microservices are only things that you're going to experience once you're in production and running that thing in anger. Those are where a lot of the challenges around sort of the monitoring, for example, are going to hit you right in the face. So start with getting one or two things. The scariest phone call I've ever had since I kind of went independent was from a consultancy based in the Middle East. They were actually, I think, they were building a system for people in the Middle East, and it was going to be a hospital management system. It was software that was previously on-prem, so they had an install in each hospital, and they were moving it into being a SaaS-based, essentially managed piece of software. It's actually a sensible decision, given the context they're in. Mm-hmm. They had just come up with an architecture that had 150 microservices that they were going to send live in 4 weeks. And they hadn't had a pilot or anything. They'd never run a SaaS business before. So going from on-prem to SaaS, one physical install, customer managed software, to a distributed system of 150 moving components. And they said, is there anything we should be worried about? I said, yes, everything. A year and a half to 2 years later, my belief is they're still not live. That's the kind of thing where it's scary. And I do work with a lot of people going from on-prem to SaaS, but that's a different conversation.
So what you're saying in a way is that first team and that first microservice, that's where you will face most of the difficulties. And I think that's where a question that Jose Sanjil, I hope I got the name right, on YouTube, asked where that question fits in. And he said, once you decide to move a part of your monolith to a microservice, let's say you have a sensible reason for that, what are your most common issues you see teams facing during the migration process? So to me, it seems like the question is around, so after you did that first microservice with that first team, what's the next problems down the line? I think that's what the question is about.
I think in general, there are different classes of problems that you're more likely to see at certain levels of scale. So the problems that you have to solve when you've got 500 microservices are quite different than when you've got 5. And the organizations that have 500 microservices have had to solve the problems that go along the way. And again, this is a bit of a pitfall, certainly large enterprises. They say, well, if we've got 10,000 microservices, we're going to need all these things done. And they spend 6 months on building a platform, right? The day one problems I tend to see that hit people early on are what is happening inside my application. It's very simple monitoring problems. So, what happened? This thing went to that and it failed. Well, how do I get the information I need out of it? So day one type problems and actually these are one of the sort of few areas where I do advocate bringing new technology in early in this process, are things like getting simple log aggregation up and running, right? It's not going to solve, log aggregation falls down at a certain point in terms of that being the only source of information. This also is where you start to realize that the people that made the decision to move to microservices often have not spoken to the people that run the software. And so it's those classical things. So we talked earlier about the divide between the physical architecture and the logical architecture. This is also where if you do have separate people running the software, which is often the case, they need to be involved in that process because they'll start telling you about these things. So early days, it is often about what the hell is this thing doing when it goes wrong. So there's the log aggregation stuff. You also get people starting to see a bit more the sense of the quality of their networks, depending on the nature of the calls between your existing software and your new microservice architecture. You start realizing, sometimes networks do fail. So they're having to work out how many retries do I do, all those sorts of issues. Those are fairly early stage problems. Early on as well, your developer tooling is probably not going to suffer too much. I go from having to run one thing on my laptop to running two. So you're not having too many issues at this point. You can stick with the same technology. You can use the same deployment process you used. Ideally it'd be automated, but that's not the end of the world for your first microservice. So I say the very, very early problems are around that simple, what the hell is this thing doing? How do I get information out of it? And importantly, how do I connect what happened inside that microservice to what's happening in the monolithic system so I can get that bigger picture? This is why, my day zero things tend to say, let's get log aggregation in, let's get correlation IDs in, and let's start adding these things a piece at a time. I think the I try and solve problems as I face them. I try and look enough down the line to see where the problems are coming, but I don't try and solve all these problems up front. So for me, it's a fundamentally an iterative process,
So I think that's actually quite interesting because I see some clients who are basically building a microservices platform before they do the very first microservice, and your advice seems to be quite different, which is, well, if you just want to deploy one microservice, maybe you stick to the stuff that you already have for the other stuff that you have in production.
There's some great advice in the Team Topologies book, which is a brilliant book, by the way, and they give the recommendation, if you build a platform, it should be optional. And this is the thing that a lot of people miss. If you make the platform optional, then the onus on the people building the platform is to make sure the platform is good and easy to use. And you're incentivized to have people running on it. Organizations which build a platform and then expect people to use it often say you have to use a platform. They're not incentivized to make it a habitable experience. So for me, if you're building a platform, you need to approach like a piece of product development. What do my customers need? My customers are the developers, the testers, the sysadmins. And so you should be iterating on what your platform looks like as you're actually building the software. And this again comes back to, that's a good reason to start maybe with one team. Let's do something that helps that one team, and then we can scale from there.
So Jose actually just asked another good question. So he said also a bit more on the implementation side. Have you worked with teams that successfully went for microservices under a monorepo structure? So maybe a few words about monorepo. If I understand correctly, it's putting everything, like in this case, all the microservices in one repository. And the big advantage would be that you can have one change in one commit that actually spans multiple microservices. I want to sort of rephrase that question a little bit and make it more controversial. Does that even make sense? Because at the end of the day, what you said is that we want autonomy, so we should avoid the situations where we have such commits that go over multiple microservices, because clearly then you don't have autonomy. So would you think that even makes sense? Would you advise against it? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, so I don't like monorepos. Now I say this from a position of having worked on the world's largest monorepo, because I spent a year at Google, right, which has, when I was there, 10,000 engineers with the vast majority of the code written by those 10,000 engineers running on top of a Perforce variant with some really interesting stuff locked around it. When you have 200 people working in your tools team, you can have a pretty interesting monorepo. There are sort of three key problems I see with a monorepo. The first is the one I think you put across extremely well. In the context of microservices, one of the things that monorepos make it easy for you to do is not something that we want to encourage or make easy, which is this idea that I can make one commit, and that makes a change across multiple microservices. Atomicity of commit doesn't help you if you don't do atomicity of deploy. And we don't want atomicity of deploy. We don't want to deploy loads of microservices together, because that's the antithesis of what we're aiming for. So in the context of microservices specifically, I agree with you totally. The two other problems that come with monorepos are around ownership and tooling. The ownership problem is one that's really important. And this is something that Google do extremely well, and their monorepo is not your monorepo. In a Google monorepo, and things may have changed since I left, and it's highly possible to have, every single directory has a file in it called owners, and that denotes who's allowed to change code in that directory. When you do a commit, you have to have be in the owners files for every single directory you touch, or have somebody in those owners files review your change. So they have a concept, effectively, of very strong ownership. These are the people responsible for making changes in this part of the system. So they have built browser plugins for Emacs, for Vi, for Eclipse, for IntelliJ, for Visual Studio, that when you do things like bring in ports and stuff, will automatically update your owners files and your dependency files. They've done that work, which is insane, right? But they can justify it. What I see with a lot of people who implement the monorepo is they don't understand that problem of ownership, and they implicitly embrace a collective ownership model. Anybody can change anything. Now, I think if you've got 15, 20 people, I think collective ownership can work. I think if you've got 200 people, it does not. If everybody owns anything, well, no one owns anything. The last point is the tooling. And if you look at how monorepos at scale work, they use graph-based build systems that need fine-grained dependency mapping. When I build a microservice, because you have you've got one repo producing multiple artifacts. How do I know what code goes in there? How do I know what changes to generate building this artifact? So again, the way that it's used to work anyway, with using Mac and Buck and Bazel, is you would have a dependency file which said, the code in this directory depends on this code in these other directories. And they would build those dependency files automatically. So when I touched a piece of code, I could go from an artifact back to those dependencies and just build the code that you need. Those systems are unlike things that most people have ever worked with. So by all means, go take a look at the graph-based build systems people use for monorepos. So if you're going to do these things at scale, you need to think about ownership, and you need to think about the new build tooling. And for microservices, they're probably a bad idea. For small teams, absolutely fine. Aside from that, I think they're okay. But I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan personally. The advantage in the context of microservices, I think the advantages they give do not justify the complication they bring.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we were talking about migrating to microservices. So in your experience, what is more common? Is it more common to have a Greenfield project where you start afresh and you just put some microservices out? Or is that migration thing where you have an existing system that is monolith and you want to migrate to microservices? Is that more common?
I would say, again, this is self-selecting, because it's just people who come to me for help or that I chat to. It's more common doing the migration. And the reason I say that is the people that start Greenfields, they only call me once they've got an issue. And that often takes them a couple of years to get into that situation. It seems to be much more common in my experience to be people that are modernizing their application. And again, this is because against the backdrop of all the other challenges enterprise organizations are facing, this is seen as the silver bullet for this situation. In my experience, actually, I think it's also can be easier to move to microservices from an existing system, because once you've got an existing system, you understand the constraints you're operating in. You understand, for example, what are our load characteristics? Which parts of applications are bottlenecks? What parts of the product change most frequently? you're also much more likely to have a stable understanding of the domain you're operating in, which in turn can make decisions about which bits of functionality should become microservices much easier. I think for those people that start spanking new with microservice architectures from the beginning, I'm absolutely sure those people are out there. It may be that all their experiences are so brilliant that they never call people like me in. But like most of the startups I've worked at, where I normally engage with them once they've found market fit, they're into scale up territory. At the heart of the vast majority of those, there's a monolithic application still sitting there, and they are now pulling things apart. So in my experience, at least, and I am only one data point, it's much more common to go from an existing monolithic architecture to microservice architecture than starting greenfields.
And what I think you just mentioned and also said during the pre-stream, and I thought was very interesting, is that in your opinion, migration is easier when you do it than doing the greenfield because there are so many nodes. So that's somewhat, it surprised me a little bit, because people are usually afraid when they have to manage legacy systems. So you seem to have a different opinion about that, concerning migration at least.
Yeah, I think it's I think that's true. I think it's also partly because I have an existential problem with the IT industry that doesn't want to clean up our messy bedrooms. Like, we keep creating systems that we don't look after properly and then dumping them and rebuilding them, and we're still doing it. And it's like, we can do better than that, guys, come on. So there's part of that is maybe, there may be some ideological thinking in there in terms of, I dislike that idea personally. But I also would say that when you're trying to create something brand new, there is, again, this is a Neil Ford term. He talks about the microservice tax. There is a cost that you pay for building intrinsically a more complicated architecture in terms of just your infrastructure, all those things. So when you're building something brand new, if you're starting with microservices, you're saying, we are happy to take part of that brain power, money, time, or whatever, and that's not going to go towards developing the new product or thinking about what the new product needs to be, and instead is going to be building out a platform, whatever else that might be. And I think that when you can articulate it like that, it can sometimes be hard to justify the diversion of effort and the diversion of talent. I think there's different things when you're building, say, a greenfield for very well-known domains. I think when you get highly structured known domains like banking, the equations shift a little bit because there's a lot of standardizations in those domains. I also think it's a bit different when you're building something from scratch that really is something you've already built before. I think that's a bit different as well, because within an organizational context, you may already have the domain and knowledge and the understanding of the environment that's going to operate in. There's always exceptions.
So if migration is so easier than greenfield, you could build a monolith as a first step. So is that something that you would advise?
Yeah, for people building new products, almost universally, I recommend that. A lot of the time I'll suggest hedging architectures. So I will suggest, okay, like, it's effectively about keeping your options open. So an example of that would be a modular monolithic architecture. So you say, well, we're building this application. We think these are the areas that we're going to need to scale. Well, why don't we define those as modules within our modular monolithic architecture? We pay a bit of cost now for keeping that stuff separate, hoping it will improve things later on. But yeah, my approach is nearly always to start with a single process monolithic application. Doesn't mean it can't be well structured. Doesn't mean you can't use domain-driven design if you want to define modular boundaries, to use the right terms. I think you should do all of those things. I think it's important that you kind of, that you still do those things well and you write good code. Daniel Bryant, I think, says, if you have a TIE file in a monolith and you take that TIE file and convert it to microservices, you've now just got loads of TIE files running in containers. So it's like, there's no reason why we can't do a good job. So I typically, I start with the monolithic system. And that tends to be my recommendation.
So what you're saying in a way is that the decision to build a monolith would be something that is reversible. So do you think that the decision to build microservices, that this could be a reversible decision too? And would it make any sense to do that?
Yep, absolutely. I think two great examples. I think one is in my book, is talking about a product called SnapCI that ThoughtWorks built, a hosted CI tool. They had a services-based architecture running 8 microservices, I think it was. And as they were developing the product, they realized they hadn't got the boundaries quite right, and it was costing them too much time having to make changes across those boundaries. They merged it back together again. There's a great talk by Alexandra from Segment, where she talks about the experiences of her team managing data ingest and egest. They do some large volumes of data work from analytical providers. And they had initially moved to a microservice architecture to help them scale, but the architecture they'd picked meant that every new provider meant a new microservice. And she had one team of like 5 or 10 people managing 60 microservices. And so they actually merged it all back into a monolithic system again, and it made their lives much happier. And she did a great talk, I think it was at KubeCon London 2020, or it might have been 2019. Absolutely it is. But I think, again, we should recognize that there's probably a bigger difference between a microservice architecture of 2 microservices and one of 1,000 microservices as there is between a monolith and, you know what I mean? So like, if you've got 1 or 2 microservices, merging those things back together again is absolutely fine. It's not a problem. It's a scale thing. Once you've got to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, again, this is also why you should take a lot of those case studies with a pinch of salt. That talk that Alex did about Segment merging this thing back together was like, oh, Segment have got rid of microservices. No, her team had. Likewise, there was a talk there was a presentation from someone from Uber saying, we moved away from microservices and created these things called macro services, which was just, we merged some things together. People said, oh, Uber don't do microservices. It's like, no, that one team decided in their context to make a different decision. In the context of both Segment and Uber, those teams were owning and operating their software. So they saw the full pain associated with that architectural choice. They were empowered in their situation to make a change in architecture to make their own lives easier. That's the power of closing that loop of service ownership. And so I think absolutely it's reversible. I think the key thing is, how do you make it reversible in a larger context? So something I talk about a lot is your team focuses on the part of the domain. You are the finance team. People need to use things that finance provides. So you're going to provide me, say, an API to the rest of the organization. Behind that API, you could have 1 microservice or 1,000. I don't care. As long as it is fast enough and it works and I get what I need, I don't care. This is effectively, a variation in information hiding. If I can hide my implementation choices behind something like an API or an evented endpoint, it's a totally reversible decision. The problem becomes, I think, where people create maybe a fine-grained microservice architecture and allow for a high degree of point-to-point communication. Then merging things back together again can become more difficult. So for me, I kind of like having coarser-grained boundaries in my system. So again, this for me does come back to the ideas around domain-driven design, because the ideas of sort of bounded contexts and nested contexts work quite well in that example.
So I like how you just described one of the fundamental concepts that we have in modularization, which is information hiding, and how you basically propose sort of a coarse-grained component that would be hidden behind the API, and the decision how that would be implemented in one or many microservices or any number of microservices is just hidden. And I think that's very important, because information hiding, just like the mythical mammoth, is something that we could know for quite a long time. Those concepts are actually quite old and important.
It's the single most important. That was the biggest epiphany when writing the second edition of the book, was going back over those ideas a few more times and realizing that information hiding, independent deployability lives or dies on information hiding. That's it, right? If you don't do information hiding, you can't have stable boundaries. You can't have controllable backwards compatibility, independent, and then therefore, independent deployability falls by the wayside. So for me, information hiding is like just super important. And I think the problem is that for many people, the concept of a module in modern programming language is such a weak, watered down concept in our modern programming languages. If we look at, people think, oh, that's like having packages and visibility, right? It's like, no, that's just how .NET does it and how Java does it. So we're sort of in a place where the programming languages, to an extent, aren't helping us. And so I think it's, chapter 2 in the Building Microservices second edition is basically mostly it's about as close to dogma as I get. Just read what Parnas wrote back in 1971, people, please. Interestingly, just to close the loop a little bit, I think Fred Brooks has talked about how the fact he disagreed vehemently with Parnas around module boundaries, and he thought information hiding was a stupid idea. He changed his mind. I think there's a paper called The Hidden History of Information Hiding that Parnas did, where he talks about those conversations. There's also a lovely series of blog posts that Adrian Collier did over at the Morning Paper blog, where he went back and revisited Parnas's papers and literally took out the word module and he wrote in the word microservice and he reread the papers. It all makes sense. Parnas himself actually came back and commented on some of those blog posts, which was lovely to see. But to give you an idea of when Parnas talks about information hiding, he thinks that if you use a module, you shouldn't even have access to the source code of the module you're using, because even that knowledge becomes a form of coupling. So there's some great, interesting insights in that space.
Exactly. I actually did an episode about information hiding by myself in German, I'm afraid. So I will put a link in the links section. But obviously that's going to be in German, and it's just interesting that we seem to come back to these original ideas around modules. And in my opinion, at least for me personally, that discussion started with microservices, and we are now back to the 70s or the 60s even concerning that. And what you said about programming languages and how the concepts are watered down, I think what we are discussing now are more coarse-grained modules, and it's the same principles like information hiding, but applied on a different level, because obviously a microservice is something that is not really supported as a first-class citizen in a programming language. It's a different thing, but there are the same abstract principles, I guess.
And just I've seen people trying to create programming languages for distributed systems that make these things first-class systems. I think that's a crazy idea personally. So I like that analogy. I don't hold with things like Ballerina. They make no sense to me. So they are coarse-grained modules, but a lot of the things we learn from modules and even object-oriented programming can help us when we're thinking about our modular microservice architectures.
So I'm just wondering whether we have some time for. That's actually a complex question, but maybe we can try to answer, or you can try to answer it. So, what is the typical mistake that you see that is being done in a migration and that really should be avoided?
I think I would say there are two that happen at different levels. The first is not having a clear through line from the work you're doing to the outcome you want. And as a result, people are very confused about what they're doing and why. One real world example, I worked for a big telco, and the CEO made one of the worst, most horrific statements I've seen, which is, we are going to go faster and save costs through moving to microservices and cloud native technology in the next 12 months. To give you an idea of the scale of this organization, one of the projects had over 50 teams running on it, and those teams had about 8 people on it. And I'm like, okay, this is never going to happen, right? Because there's no threat. So he wants you to go faster, A, and reduce costs, B. How do I put those ideas into practice on the ground, knowing that moving to microservices never saves you money, certainly not in the short term, right? So I'm now screwed. So you need that through line. What is it we're trying to achieve? And when that gets disconnected, you end up with a rudderless ship and people just doing work for the sake of it. The second, much more practical problem I see is the problem that you talked about before, which is people building the platform before they need it. This is something that only really big organizations do. They've got the money to go out and believe that the platform will solve the problem. And we've been here before with private cloud and all these other things that we did. So for me, that's the other problem. And to an extent, it's a manifestation of the same problem from before. There's a belief that the platform will solve the problem. And that's a different category of issue, but is maybe related.
But I mean, if you build that platform, how it just seems to be a waste of money. It doesn't seem to be like a problem, except for it's a waste of money. So is there anything else apart from it's a potentially huge waste of money?
I mean, the rationale behind it isn't bad. The idea is, if you want teams to have more autonomy, we want to have more responsibility. But how do you give people more responsibility without giving them loads more work? So the idea of the platform is, and I'd use another term from team topologies. They talk about these enabling teams. The people kind of doing the feature delivery work who own the microservices, you have other people around that support them, that enable them to do their jobs. You should view the platform as an enabler. I use the platform because there's a bunch of busy work I can offload to the platform in a self-service way to help me be more productive. But the platform is there to serve those teams, not to control or limit them. So I think the idea of the platform itself is bad. And let's be honest, when you go and say, I'm using AWS, you're buying into a platform then at that point, right? I don't think the idea itself is bad. I just think the way a lot of organizations choose to embrace those ideas leads to some of the familiar problems that we've seen time and time again.
Okay, so anything else you want to add, or?
No, I just say thank you for having me. I'm hoping some of you will come onto OOP. I'm talking about the interactions between organizational structures and microservices. And if you do want to read any of my books, there's information over my website. I'm just samnewman.io. I've also got links to a lot of presentations I've done over the years. Virtually all of them are available for free, just on YouTube links and things. So they can find lots more information there. And so the second edition of Building Microservices is now available in print. It will be translated at some point into German. I've been promised that will happen, but I don't know when. So you just don't, I have no control of that process, no say of that process, as anyone who's worked in publishing books knows. So that will happen. But if you can bring yourself to read it in English, it is available. And you can, I think if you're an ACM member or you're an O'Reilly member, you can read that for free, or you can get ebooks and print books, whatever.
Yeah, and I will definitely put a link to your website and also to the books on in the show notes. Okay, so thanks a lot. Looking forward to hear your talk at OOP. One thing that I forgot to mention, so there is also an episode about team topologies, also in German, I'm afraid, so I will put that also in the links. And yeah, that's it. So thanks a lot for having for being here on the show, and I'm really looking forward to see you at OOP and maybe at a different time at different conferences when we can actually meet in person again.
It might happen. I think my first one is scheduled to maybe be Craft Conf. I'm really hoping that one goes ahead in person and I can make it there. So that's one of my favorite conferences. But hopefully, cross fingers, we'll do something in person this year.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot and see you.
Thank you so much. Take care.